I've been doing spooky videos all month for Halloween, but the number of spooky topics we have in mainline Fire Emblem is actually pretty limited. So I decided to round things out by doing a character analysis on one of the game's many dark mages. I mean, dark magic is evil magic, and evil magic is kind of spooky, right? So I had my patrons vote, and we are going to be talking about Odin Dark, the most eccentric mage in Fire Emblem Fates. Just to clarify, this is purely a character video, so we are going to be analyzing his characterization without diving super deep into the gameplay. But if you are interested in a close look at Odin Dark from a gameplay perspective, friend of the channel Blue Cosmic is putting up a video about just that to go along with this one as a companion piece, so make sure to check their work out as well. It will, of course, be linked in the description. But otherwise, let's take a look at one of my favorite characters in all of Fire Emblem, the Chosen One, Odin Dark. Odin starts out with a heck of a first impression. He joins your army screaming about his aching blood and how the darkness compels him to do what he must. With over-the-top lines like, "My darkness was darker than yours," and the delivery to match, it doesn't take long to label Odin as incredibly extra, even by Fate's standards. Yes, this is a game where most people introduce themselves by declaring what their cartoonish quirk is, but Odin comes off as weird even to them, and this is commented on in several of his supports. In my currently ongoing Conquest playthrough, we chose to marry Odin, and during the proposal to Corrin, Odin was unwilling to let his shtick go until Corrin walked away, at which point Odin was finally able to muster up the energy to act like a normal human being. Well, for about 5 seconds before he went back to his old ways, telling Corrin that he thought that they wouldn't mind because he had already proposed. Now, in fairness, Corrin usually plays the part of straight man in their supports, and as a result of this, the more eccentric factors of their support partners tend to come out in those chains. But the thing is, it's not just the Corrin support where Odin seems incredibly extra. As late as the A support in many of his chains, Odin is still seen as weird by most of his co-workers. Mozu says that the others warned her not to get involved with his games, Camilla is still taken aback by his speech patterns, and Felicia kind of summarizes the whole situation perfectly. She says that the army has no shortage of oddballs, but Odin is the only one consistently labeled as weird by other people. He's just that much more eccentric that it sticks out even amongst the Norians. And I think there are a couple of factors at play for this. The first is that many of the gimmicks of the characters in Conquest are just exaggerated versions of real-life character traits. While Effie's obsession with working out, Arthur's selflessness, and Niall's endless horniness are certainly silly, you can definitely find gym bros, selfless people, and horny people in the real world. In contrast, there's not really a real-life equivalent to someone who likes to pretend that their arm is possessed by dark forces, at least to my knowledge. And just to be clear, Odin is pretending. He says as much in his support with Elise. But on the topic of supports, they are the main reason that I think Odin is a step above the rest of the Fates cast in terms of weirdness. You see, most of the Fates characters follow a simple formula in how they are depicted. They have one or two overwhelming gimmicks that are front and center during the main story and many of their C supports, but if you dive deeper into their support chains, they get more fleshed out with #hidden depth. Sometimes that means revealing the reason for the eccentricities, such as Charlotte revealing to Xander why she puts up such a childish front, or in some cases, they learn to move past their unhealthy behaviors, such as Jacob being able to take himself less seriously in his supports with Elise, or Baruka learning to open up and let others in her supports with Benny and Selena. Odin kind of doesn't get an example of either. He remains every bit as overdramatic during inappropriate times, such as his proposals, and we don't really get any sort of backstory to explain away his behavior. In fact, in the majority of Odin's supports, it feels like he comes out the other side with a worse relationship to the other person than when he began. Niles is able to prove that Odin isn't as good at naming things as he thinks he is. Mozu just refuses to interact with him after their A support. And Azura proclaims that being spotted with Odin doing weird dances is more traumatizing than her tragic backstory. Honestly, the way the rest of the cast treats Odin is kind of cruel. And controversial statement, I don't think he deserves this just for acting like a theater kid. Especially because those who give him a chance find that his presence makes their lives better, not worse. The most prominent of these is Elise. Since she is a child, she's able to tolerate his childish behavior, and she has fun hanging out with him and listening to all his cool stories. And eventually ends up treating his talking style like a fun game. Effie initially humors Odin in order to please Lady Elise, but as she spends time with him, she's inspired by his self-confidence and ends up herself becoming more confident, thusly improving her workout routine. Leo tries his hardest to get rid of Odin with impossible tasks out of spite, but as Odin proves himself again and again, he soon realizes he has himself a very loyal retainer and a true friend. So yeah, most of Odin's dialogue wouldn't feel out of place in My Immortal, but he's still a nice guy. And I do think it's rather a shame the rest of the cast won't give him a chance just because he's a little bit weird. In fact, his weirdness is kind of why I like him. He's just the quintessential quirk character. No growth, no tragic backstory, just an incredibly extra gimmick. Well, I mean, I say he has no backstory, but Odin does actually have a very tragic backstory that's expanded upon more than the various tragic backstories of the other Fates characters. It's just that his backstory isn't one in the game Fire Emblem Fates. So, if we want to fully understand Odin Dark, we kinda gotta take a look at Fire Emblem Awakening. A major part of Fire Emblem Awakening's plot is time travel. In the future, the bad guy Grima won and killed the entirety of the main cast, so their children travel back in time in order to try and change things. I've heard a lot of people criticize this aspect of the story, but as someone who generally doesn't like Awakening's story, the time travel aspect has always worked for me. I think it's a cool and creative way to bring the second generation into Awakening's story, and as a result of it, most of the second generation has their personalities significantly affected by the trauma of surviving the horrifying event of their parents and everyone they knew dying. Yarn becomes terrified of dying and transfers this fear onto literally everything else. Jerome slips into depression and isolation. Lucina throws herself fully into her work saving her father, and though it's never made explicit, I would say that Owain's character gimmicks are also likely a result of this trauma. I don't think it's a coincidence that so much of his overdramatic stuff revolves around him being the chosen hero who must protect people after he failed to protect everyone in the dark future. Like, this is the sort of origin story that a lot of superheroes have. But regardless of the cause of Owain's behavior, one thing that became increasingly clear as I looked through his supports is that he doesn't act nearly as bizarre as Odin does. I'm aware that they are the same character, but from the way that they carry themselves, it feels like two very different people. Yes, both have the obsession with naming weapons and talk about the darkness possessing them and their boiling blood, but whereas Odin in Fates is almost entirely unable to turn off his performance, Owain is much more reserved about it. In fact, in his support with his cousin Lucina, it becomes clear that he talks normally to her because he doesn't think it's appropriate to put on airs when talking to a princess. Similarly, in the conversation with Lissa, Owain acts much less eccentric because he cares about his mother and she doesn't like it when he talks like an edgelord. But even in the supports where Owain feels perfectly comfortable embracing his gimmick, it isn't as all-encompassing as it is for Odin in Fates. Take his supports with Kjell or Cynthia, for example. He will ham things up for a line or two, but then snap back to talking like a normal person. In Awakening, it's clear he's just having fun with the speech pattern, whereas in Fates it feels like a compulsion. Remember, he's unable to take himself seriously even while proposing to Corrin, despite the fact that Corrin explicitly says she doesn't like it. This is a far cry from the Owain that we know from Awakening. And the Flanderization of his character is actually somewhat addressed in his support conversations with his fellow Awakening units, that being Laszlo, aka Inigo, and Selena, aka Severa. Laszlo talks about feeling disconnected from his past self, and wonders whether he truly is the same person as Inigo from Awakening. He talks about absorbing the experiences in Fateslandia, and how it makes him wonder whether the memories from Awakening even truly belong to him. In fact, the three of them have lived on 3 different worlds, technically. The 2 timelines of Elise, one good and one bad, as well as whatever the settings of Fates is. While Odin expresses confidence that he is the same person as Owain, part of me wonders if the amount of time that he spent playing the part of Odin influenced his personality. Owain always had a flair for the dramatic, and so it honestly seems kind of reasonable that spending so much time absorbing a role and playing his part would lead to those eccentricities becoming more ingrained in his personality. Like, if we're being realistic, the reason that Odin feels Flanderized compared to Owain is probably something to do with the writing quality of Fire Emblem Fates, but I do kind of like that there is an in-world explanation I can come up with enough logical leaps. And looking at it from that perspective, I guess Odin technically does fit the pattern of leads with his gimmick and then has some hidden depth. It just is a bit more hidden than some other characters. So that is where I was going to end the video, but as I was in the editing process, I decided to throw a poll out there to see what other people think about Odin's weirdness compared to the rest of the Fates cast, and I was surprised to find that the majority think he fits right in. It's by no means a unanimous opinion. About a quarter of the people who answered the poll thought that he was weirder than average, but about 3/4 thought that he was just as weird or even more normal than the rest of the cast. I was thinking about why this might be the case, and I can't really come up with a concrete answer. Part of it is probably just Fates' reputation for having weirdos, and part of it probably comes from people not diving into supports. Plus, let's be real, there is a non-negligible amount of Fire Emblem fans who just say every new game full of weirdos bad anime, but normal in old game. And that probably influenced the results to some degree. But regardless, this made me want to examine the rest of the cast of Conquest and see just how weird they are. Have I been underestimating the strange factor?
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
So I've decided to look further into that. Myself and Blue Cosmic are going to be doing a Fates Weirdness power scaling video, where we categorize the units in Conquest by how odd we think they are. So, if that sounds like the sort of thing that you'd like, I guess subscribe. Anyway, I hope you liked this deep dive into the character of the Chosen One. Don't forget to check out Blue's video on Odin as a unit, which is linked below, and if you're gonna comment while you're down there, the comment code word of the day is Mistletoe, so make sure you include Mistletoe in your comment. That way I know you made it to the end of the video. And since it is the end of the video, I should thank my patrons. So thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Reflect, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Axel Rosenberg, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Belwenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Daegis, Joanna the Wrenchwitch, Roman Kormancic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, and especially my Jakins, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon down below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Regardless of what you choose to do though, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.